unknown to Toronto, not a stranger to Toronto, in fact, as he will tell you later. This is part of his North American tour.
Or saga.
He's been to several universities in the US and in Vancouver already, and this is the last part of his tour. Currently he's done a lot of things, so I'll try and sum up a few as we are also waiting for the camera and the tripod to arrive so that we can cover the event in video. Michalis is currently the 1821 Fellow in Modern Greek Studies at the British School of Athens, where he's leading the research program Unpublished Archives of British Philhellenism during the Greek Revolution, 1821-1832, a program that the British School in Athens has co-organized with the National Library of Greece and which is generally supported by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Michalis may be a historian, I think he is, but he did not start as one. He actually studied first political science at the University of Athens, before turning to history, initially at the University of York, and then at the School of Advanced Studies in Paris, and the University of London, where he was awarded his PhD. He has taught or worked as a researcher at the Universities of London, Oxford, Athens, Thrace in Greece, and Princeton University. His research focuses on the history of the modern Greek world with a special emphasis on intellectual and global history, the age of revolutions, and the history of political practices during the long 19th century more generally. His studies have been published in several fora and in several languages, while his monograph, Liberalism After the Revolution, see here, from the intellectual foundations of the Greek state, circa 1830-1880, was recently published by Cambridge University Press, and a candidate of, I think, a very good one for the Modern Greek Studies Association Best Book Award of 2024. He is currently editing a volume entitled Philhellenism and the Greek Revolution of 1821 Towards the Global History, which will be published shortly. Last but not least, and a warm congratulations, in October 2024, Michalis will join the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer in Modern Greek Studies, a new position that was made possible thanks to the generous support of the Leventis Foundation. And Michalis, we're really looking forward to your talk, A Forgotten Liberal Legacy, the Greek Constitutions of 1844 and 1864.
One that held a very strong relationship with the high political context and informed directly the constitutional processes and ultimately the formation of the state. But who were the jurists? Historians have at times referred to some of them, most of whom you can see on the slide, such as Pavlos Kaligas, Nikolaos Saripoulos, Georgios Rallis, Marcos Renieris, Diomidis Kyriakos, and Ioannis Soutsos, to name but the most important. But they have never delved into the details of their works, their political engagements, and their public actions. Although very different, the jurists had many things in common. Born within empires, and almost all of them outside the space that was going to become the Greek state, most were displaced on account of the outbreak of the Greek Revolution. They all had a wide life experience and education in numerous universities such as Heidelberg, Berlin, Göttingen, Munich, Paris, Geneva, Bologna, to name but a few. An experience that was responsible for their remarkable cosmopolitan outlook, as well as for the eclecticism of their thought. Although they conversed with a number of schools of thought, they used them in their own way and for their own purposes. To say that the role of these scholars was important would be an understatement. Their multifarious professional activity is telling. There were at times lawyers, judges, including of the Supreme Court, ministers, prime ministers, novelists, poets, governors of banks, members and founders of associations, and of course, professors at the law school, all of them. But before I get to the heart of the issue, I should say that in order to understand how the liberal proposals played out in the constitutional crisis, we should also take into account the constitutional legacy of the revolution. one that saw actually during the revolution 4 national assemblies and 4 constitutions. The conventional line is that the main legacy was a perception of the nation as the collective political actor, of the state as the central political authority, of the constitution as a higher form of law, and of the national conventions as higher forms of lawmaking. But I would argue that there was more to this constitutional legacy. First, constitutions and/or national conventions had become legitimate means of resistance. Second, during and because of the revolution, an active conception of citizenship developed that entailed a shift from a political system built around social hierarchy to one based on participation in and commitment to the revolution. Third, the Greek constitutional experience, similar to the American one but also to today's European unions, was an attempt to accommodate 2 political idioms, languages, and spatial imaginations. On the one hand, that of the local patrida. Even today, if you ask a Greek where you're from, he or she will probably reply first by the local place where he or she was born. And of the local patrida of indigeneity and the concomitant rights or privileges of provincial autonomy reminiscent of the Ottoman period. And on the other, that of the nation that sought to encompass and at times surpass this indigeneity. Constitutionalism could be used both ways, as a way to devolve political authority to the patride, to the local patride, or as a way to break them up and enhance national unity. That said, the de facto suspension of the constitutions, especially after 1827, and in particular the treaty signed between the great powers and Bavaria that made Greece a hereditary monarchy, were significant blows to liberal politics. The main reason being that the treaty made no mention of or reference to the monarch granting representative institutions, consultative bodies, or even a constitution. Historians have shown that the establishment of the state affected Greek nationalism by providing a territorial and political center, and by giving content to national identity. And yet, this focus has somewhat obscured the intense discussions on sovereignty, law, individual rights, and the nature of political power that took place in administrative, legal, and academic milieu, in the press and other public forums, and after 1844 in the Parliament and the Senate. 3 strands of discourse were eminent. The first was an administrative discourse promoted by the Bavarian elites. As also stipulated in the foundational treaties with which the political structure of the Greek state had been established, a fundamental feature of this discourse was the idea that the king was the single and supreme sovereign of the kingdom. For the Bavarians, this meant that the monarch, in his own person, represented the Greek nation and alone was capable of standing above particularistic interests and of expressing the nation's will. As for their conception of the state and their reform agenda, these were informed by the German technology of the police state, the Polizeistaat. According to this, and we should not confuse the term with how we understand it today, the state had 2 main objectives. Externally, to improve the position of the state vis-à-vis the other European states, and internally, to foster order and the happiness or the well-being of the state and its population. All these being key terms in the political vocabulary of the Bavarians and of the Polizeistaat. What is more, in this conception, the king was distinct from the institution of the state. Land was not patrimony of the dynasty, but state property, while the ruler received revenue as the supreme servant of the state. The second discourse was juridical, and was endorsed by a mix of Bavarians and European educated Greek literati, many of whom I already mentioned, such as Pavlos Kaligas, Emil Herzog, Emmanuel Kokinos, Marcos Renieris, Petros Paparigopoulos, Georgios Rallis, and Diomidis Kyriakos. And by the way, Petros Paparigopoulos is the brother, for those who know about Greek historiography, of Konstantinos Paparigopoulos, the historian. This was an elitist liberal current, which I call the Romanist or the contractualist. Intellectually close both to the French doctrinaire and in particular to the German historical school of law, the Romanists understood the legal order flexibly, as constituted by a mix of prescription and tradition. One reason for which the jurists turned to the historical school of law was because it offered them a very consistent method with which to proceed in the legal formation of the state. A legal formation that should, according to the jurists, be based on the Greek version of Roman law, that common legal language that bounded the socio-geographical space identified as Europe. The guardians or the watchmen, if you like, of this process would be the jurists themselves. But this is half of the story. For the Romanist vision was a powerful political and social ideology. One key feature of this vision was the theory of the Rechtsstaat, the law-bound state, the kratos δικαίου in Greek. A sort of a third way between the authoritarian absolutist state and the radical French Republican model. For this project to take hold, reforms in administration and in contractual relationships were crucial. Accordingly, the Romanists favored representative bodies, even though, like their counterparts in France and elsewhere, they sought to limit the choice of representatives to the capacitaire. In contrast to the Bavarian discourse, this one maintained that bearers of public authority, royalty included, should be subject to legal norms, and that the goal of public policy should be to ensure individual prosperity. That said, the juridical and administrative discourses were not antithetical. On the contrary, the Romanists supported the two main civilizational projects undertaken by the monarchy. One sought to inculcate the virtues of industriousness and productivity in the population, and was implemented through various channels. One was, in fact, the University of Athens, which was founded in 1837. The other consisted in consolidating the state as the sole source of political power and took many forms: organizing the military forces, an educational system, a state church, redrawing the administrative map of the country, and introducing a new justice system. The drafting and enactment of 4 legal codes, all between 1833 and 1835, was a key part of this last project, and of the authorities' attempt to subject people to a uniform law. As they saw it, both the Bavarians and the Romanists, this was crucial for legitimizing the state, forging national unity, and making the members of the nation forget their differences, by taming centrifugal forces, a process that Abbé Sieyès, during the French Revolution, had already called adunation. A third, more radical liberal strand of discourse gradually appeared within the juridical milieu, what I call the constitutionalist. Articulated by scholars such as Ioannis Soutsos and Nikolaos Saripoulos, this current was much more attentive to the revolutionary tradition, employing explicitly political terms. Not only did this strand develop a more communitarian understanding of liberty, but it also introduced a different perception of what the state is and the public institutions are, what they should do, and what their relationship with the individual should be. The intellectual tour de force behind this thinking was Nikolaos Saripoulos, a Cypriot. It was he who, especially in the 1850s, changed the terms of constitutional thinking by drawing on natural law theories and by locating sovereignty in the nation. Saripoulos had two main concerns: how to give political expression to the principles of national sovereignty and individual rights, and how to eliminate the chance of them being usurped. All this he sought to do without being an anti-monarchist. I forgot to say that Saripoulos was the first holder of the chairs of constitutional law and international law at the University of Athens. Saripoulos responded to these concerns with three theoretical points and institutional proposals. First, he argued for a more explicit protection and expansion of individual rights and liberties. Second, he proposed a complex political system in which powers were both separated and taking each other. and he did so by seeing all political institutions, monarchy, parliament, senate, as having competing claims to represent the nation. The third response, which he shared with Souchos, was that he did not limit political participation in voting. For the constitutionalists, we become who we are as individuals by coming together, by participating in collectivities. Hence the importance they ascribe to collective institutions, to sociability, and to virtues which were public-oriented and would enhance a robust public life. So what, you may wonder, just academics and their theories? In fact, between the establishment of the monarchy in 1833 and the promulgation of a second monarchical constitution in 1864, these discourses informed, and especially the liberal ones, informed responses to social, political, and intellectual tensions. A case in point is what I consider to be the first crack in the consensus between the Romanists and the Bavarians. That was the civil code issue, which came in public attention when in 1837 the state authorities stated their willingness to adopt the French civil code as the civil code of Greece. In response, Romanists, such as Marcos Renieris and Pavlos Kaligas in particular, quite young at the time, published a series of articles and pamphlets in which they asked whether it was possible to legislate without taking into account the local historical context. Such disputes had two wider implications. First, by speaking out, the jurists claimed a wider public role as intellectuals. Second, although they did not question monarchical rule as such, this was the first moment that an intellectual challenge to monarchical rule was formed. A challenge that took the form of a political language framed in terms of rights, the rule of law, the creation of consultative bodies, and of taking into account local conditions in policy reforms. This had a wider political effect as it informed the constitutional and anti-absolutist claims that were becoming prominent in the late 1830s. These claims were on the rise for several reasons. Reforms had halted, brigadage and local disorder abounded, and the standing army and police existed only on paper. But what was to be done? Criticisms against the monarchy drew in fact on the juridical discourse as evidenced by the blueprint of reforms which Alexandros Mavrokordatos submitted to the king in 1841 in his bid to head the cabinet. As King Otto refused to comply, the opposition found two allies in two novel monarchical institutions, the National Guard and the Council of State, the highest monarchical legal institution which was composed of several jurists. When the Guard petitioned the king for a constitution in September 1843, the Council of State, in what was at the time an unprecedented move, published two so-called national acts, thereby claiming to represent the nation and accepting the claims of the revolutionaries to convoke a National Assembly and to draft the constitution. This is how we arrived at the first National Assembly of 1843-44. Now, how can we summarize the constitutional proceedings? What was made very clear from the very beginning was that the aim of the assembly was not to undermine the king, but to negotiate with him. Hence the proposition, made in fact in the first couple of days, that the constitution was a pact, a contract between the king and the nation. The main cleavage in the assembly was along political lines. On the one hand, the moderates, who supported a strong monarchy under a constitution, and on the other, the so-called left Septembrists, named after their role in the Revolt of September, who sought a liberal constitution with extensive powers granted to the people. It was the moderates that held the upper hand, and it was they who drew upon the juridical claims, especially of the Romanists, favoring a strong monarchical principle. Hence the stipulation that all sovereign power emanated from the monarch who had extensive executive powers. How can we explain this? In the words of François Guizot, the French Prime Minister, always abreast of Greek affairs, this was, and I quote, in order to contain reactionary ideas and also certainly the radical tendencies of the country, end of quote. His fears hark back to early parliamentary discussions that linked political rights to indigeneity. In addition, he, like many others in the assembly, was worried to find particular regions such as Mani and Psara in the islands and mainland Greece, seeking special rights of representation, threatening the unity of the nation. Almost a generation after the revolution, as many liberals feared, regional patride, the local homelands, remained strong. To forestall the breakup of the nation, Ioannis Koletis, who would later become the first prime minister of the state, articulated in the assembly the great idea, the megali idea, of an irredentist political project that would unite the nation. This context, which I think is the context of the articulation of the great idea, has been totally missed by historians of Greek nationalism. This monarchical principle notwithstanding, the constitution divided legislative power between the king, the Chamber of Deputies, and the Senate. It thus satisfied some liberal demands by adding political legitimacy to monarchical power, by guaranteeing basic civil and political liberties, and by introducing ministerial accountability and trial by jury. Although historians tend to downplay these changes, the establishment of elections and of two regularly meeting national chambers opened up new arenas of political activity and confrontation. This was the case especially after the late 1840s, as the economic situation of the country deteriorated, public debt soared, an agricultural crisis hit, and the state was unable to meet its international financial obligations. There is a past in everything in a way. In this atmosphere, the nature of the political order became a subject of heated discussions in several milieux, including in the University of Athens, where public law now made its appearance as a subject. So it was after the promulgation of the Constitution that the chair of constitutional law was established in the university. In fact, these discussions were saturated with law. This was indeed the golden moment of Greek liberal jurisprudence. What is more, the debates and the tone of the jurists became increasingly rather confrontational. I will give one, and this is my favorite example. In the Romanist agenda, property and a society of small property owners played a key role. But the strength with which the Romanists advocated the idea can only make sense if we take into account the central socio-political issue in Greece at the time, that is, the national land, the status that is of Ottoman property, which after the revolution was transformed into Greek state domain. And just to give you the number, we're talking about the 65% of Greece's arable land. By several measures, according to the jurists, the Bavarians were obstructing the distribution of land and preserving the state's monopoly on it. For the Romanists, this was a cause de guerre, a reason for war. As they saw it, transforming tenants into landowners was a key part of their donation, of forging national unity, and of turning Greece into a proper European state. As a response, and through their role, a very critical and crucial role in the legislative committee, the Romanists activated during the 1850s a subversive legislative process that would consolidate private property rights. One of the most important means was the application of the Roman law of prescription, according to which an occupied or possessed land or asset could be transformed into private property by a lapse of time. This opened the way to ownership for anyone who could show continuous occupation of a piece of land, or of having witnesses to prove this occupation. In addition, several courts frequently supported the cultivators or those whom the state deemed squatters against the state. As some of the Romanists had predicted, the technical application of Romanist principles in courts would facilitate the making of a society of small, freeholding property owners and farmers. They would also transform gradually land into a commodity. Criticisms and interventions such as this did not only carry the day during the 1850s. They also fed into harsh criticism against the king and the monarchy, especially late in the decade. In fact, I would argue that they became the ideological underbelly of the revolution of 1862, and the revolution that was from the outset a full-blown revolution against the king and the monarchical order. It was, in other words, a struggle about the principles and practice of government, not only a controversy between social groups seeking to impose their will. How can we explain this? Although the revolution of 1862 is generally understudied, historians have long stressed three factors: popular discontent, the rise of a radical opposition, and the role of the printed word, newspapers. That said, they have not explored the specific claims against the king or what the deputies in the Constituent Assembly later on sought to accomplish. Discontent, of course, was widespread and mounting since early in the decade, as the economic situation of the country was going from bad to worse. The humiliating events during the Crimean War, which saw the occupation by the Allied powers of Piraeus, the main port of Greece, the imposition of a naval blockade and of a new cabinet, which at the time was called by the press the Occupation Cabinet, Υπουργείων Κατοχής, only added insult to injury. The imposition of financial control in 1859 was the icing on the cake. Again, there is a past in everything. In the eyes of many contemporaries, the jurists included, these challenges did not just undermine national prosperity, they also jeopardized the status of Greece as an independent state. As a result, they became very vocal in their criticisms against the monarchy. Things were further radicalized between 1859 and 1862, as discontent spread among the younger generation. Riots erupted. Even an attempt at Queen Amalia's life was made. You can see Queen Amalia on the right, which nearly succeeded. Otto retorted by rigging elections, appointing favorites to office, and by suppressing dissatisfaction. Now, what ultimately made this a legitimacy crisis, and indeed gave the revolution its language, was the way in which the king's rule increasingly came to be seen as a usurpation of power. The king, so the opposition was saying, was unsettling the balance of the constitution, and in so doing, breaking the contract with the nation. There were two possible solutions to this situation. One was to attempt to resettle the balance by way of a reform program. The other was to reconstitute completely the political order by breaking the contract with the king. The failure of the first attempt, attempted by the old and very respectful Konstantinos Kanaris, he was one of the heroes of the Greek Revolution, early in 1862, opened the way for the second. Things came to a head in October of 1862 with a series of revolts in the countryside. When Athens joined the revolt at the middle of the month, the die was cast. By the end of the month, the king had been ousted and national elections for a constituent assembly called. But then what was to be done? This is always the now what question that all revolutionaries have to face. In fact, the jurists played a key role in shaping the outcome of the events. It was not just that the liberal discourse they had helped shape found its way into the revolutionary texts and later in the constitutional proceedings. There were actually also active participants in the events themselves, with Nikolaos Saripoulos, the constitutional lawyer that I mentioned before, playing a key role in drafting the revolutionary texts of the provisional government. Now, if one looks at these texts, two things stand out. The one is the way the revolutionaries sought to justify legally the break from the king. This they did by referring to the injuries Otto had inflicted on the body politic, the apparent corruption of his monarchy, and the usurpation of the individual rights of the citizen. The second is the very difficult balance these texts sought to strike. On the one hand, they sought to moderate the revolution by setting as its primary goal not the overthrow of the monarchy and of the existing order, but the election of a new king. On the other, they made a radical call to reset the political structure of the monarchy. A case in point of this latter was the very last proclamation produced by the provisional government right before the elections for the National Assembly. And this is undeniably written by Saripoulos, if you ask me. By introducing a distinction between the corrupt political form of royalty, basilia in the text, and the good and sound form of monarchy, monarchia, constitutional monarchy, the text made clear that the role of the future assembly was to overturn the past and establish the system of government of which the nation had been deprived by the fallen royalty, to establish that is a proper constitutional monarchy. By so doing, these texts laid the groundwork for the future constitutional debates. Most of the jurists were elected to the National Assembly and to the drafting committee. Some of them also held ministerial positions. Actually, Diomedis Kyriakos became for a period the Prime Minister, while Nikolaos Saripoulos was the rapporteur of the constitutional draft. How can we summarize the changes brought about by this second constitutional process? One thing to note is that, as Saripoulos envisioned, political power was now clearly transferred to the nation. This the National Assembly did with 5 moves. First, by justifying the overthrowing of the king as the outcome of the nation's collective will. He is kicked out because the nation collectively said so. Second, by making the nation the sole author of the constitution, while denying any role to the king in the drafting or revision process. And that came after a very long negotiation with the new king that had already been elected by the National Assembly. And even the election of the king was symbolic. It meant that the power was in the assembly itself. Third, by nationalizing representation. Deputies were now expected to speak in the name of the nation as a whole, not in the name of their constituencies, of the local patrites, that is. 4. By constitutionalizing universal, direct and secret suffrage. Of course, only for men, but that was implicit, not explicit. 5. By stipulating that the nation had the right, if not the duty, to resist in case the constitution was usurped. This provision, that was meant to put checks on all powers, would have a long life. Some of you may remember or have heard of the 114, which corresponds to the constitutional article that specified this right, and it became very popular in the 1960s and 70s. But then, the deputies had to face the most tricky issue: how to ensure that this power of the nation will not collapse into a cascade of usurpations that would threaten both the nation and the rights of the citizen. The issue, in other words, was one that preoccupied liberals across the world after Napoleon: how to combine representative government with a constitutional monarch as head of state, and at the same time erect barriers against prerogative power, whether of the king or of representative institutions. The deputies came up with 2 solutions. The first was by way of more carefully protecting rights, and mainly by expanding individual rights. Hence, for example, the abolition of censorship, with some qualifications to be sure, and the addition of the rights of assembly and association, with which the framers sought to expand the meaning of political participation. They also called future governments to proceed in a distribution of land. That was a provision that was actually put into the constitutional text itself. The other solution came via the king, and here things become even more tricky. One big change was that the king was now seen as an integral part of the nation, not an external entity with which the nation had a contract. But he still would have extensive powers. Why? Because as the framers saw it, the way to avoid the usurpation of power was by putting more contestation to it. The starting point of this logic was to break with the idea that there has to be one law-making authority to which all other authorities must be subordinate, whether this was the parliament or the monarch. The way the framers saw it, the possibility of usurpation could be diminished only by having competing powers with the capacity to check each other. This led them to create an institutional arrangement in which both the king and the parliament would have competing claims claims to speak in the name of the nation. This arrangement created, of course, a tension between the two authorities, king and parliament. But the creation of this tension, that's one of my key points, was deliberate. In what seems to me a very American moment of Greek constitutionalism, the point was that these two authorities that represented the nation would have to negotiate with each other for the good of the nation. To conclude, what are we to make of all this? One point that needs to be emphasized once more is that to argue that Greek liberalism was feebly underdeveloped or derivative of some sort of core liberalism stemming from Western Europe is to be missing a much more interesting story of intellectual breadth, syncretism and creativity. In fact, if placed within a European-wide perspective, liberals in Greece were much more attentive to the revolutionary tradition and had much more positive views of the people and of popular sovereignty than many of their counterparts in Northern Europe. And they did so even after 1847, when by all accounts liberalism elsewhere in Europe became gradually more conservative. To understand these features of Greek liberalism, we need to take into account both the intellectual context of post-Napoleonic Europe and the political context of Greece. It was as a response to the Bavarian political agenda or its failings that the jurists transformed liberalism into an alternative mode of statecraft that paved the way for the long revolution of the 1860s. In other words, in Greece, liberalism developed as an active political doctrine and was strongly associated with public policy reforms. This, I think, should act as a reminder to intellectual historians, like myself, of the need to better link ideas to political practices and political change, something many of us, and actually most of us, are reluctant to do. But I think there is also a longer story to be told here, and actually to be explored further, because this liberal synthesis left a legacy in Greek political culture that goes well beyond the 19th century. Firstly, the tension between the parliament and the crown as two competing institutions in which the sovereignty of the nation was invested characterized Greek political life up until 1974, when the monarchy was finally abolished. But I think it may also explain things that came after. Could, for example, the almost unchecked power of the executive in the Greek political system be the outcome of the sudden collapse of the tension I described here and the move towards a system that concentrated authority in the parliament and eventually in government? This is not, of course, to defend the monarchy, but it is to think about what I believe is a problem of the Metapolitefsi period, the golden jubilee of which we're celebrating actually this year. Second, the two liberal traditions I have been describing here had, I think, a long life, one that reaches our own times, with of course important adjustments. The Romanist variety developed into what could be called a liberalism of the subject, a language that focuses on the individual and takes freedom to be a merely legal formal quality, and the goal of public policy to ensure individual prosperity. A language that also seeks to limit public office to the capacitaire, or in our more modern language, to the experts. The other tradition has developed into a sort of communitarian liberalism that does not see society as an aggregate of individuals, but as members of an organic whole. This liberal current has a more substantive understanding of freedom, close to the Kantian notion of autonomy, and an agonistic view of politics, which is to be achieved through the public sphere and in particular through political action. I think we saw both these currents in action after 2008 and during the so-called long Greek crisis. The second strand in particular in the myriad of local cultural and political initiatives that took place, including the good and the bad ones. In closing, what all this means, at least from my perspective, is that ideas and what people carry in their heads do matter and do make a difference. To reduce this to epiphenomena of socioeconomic structures is to make nonsense of the past and of the many things that people of the past thought about, wrote about, and actually did. And I don't think we historians and social scientists more generally have got that right. Thank you for your patience.
Mikhail, thank you very much. I think we got, at least from the last few slides, an idea and a sense of why this work is very important in the longer run, but also in the shorter run, and why it has been very few people who, since I think the 1960s, then John Petropoulos, Statecraft and Politics in Modern Greece, have tackled this extremely difficult from a point of view of understanding the context on the ground and inside people's heads, as Mikhail said, about what were the foundations, the intellectual foundations of the Greek state, as is the subtitle of Mikhail's book. And also a very strong argument for intellectual history that has been, I think, largely ignored in Greece, pretty much. From the point of view of the context within European, but also broader developments. Also, very strong point in favor of the role of the empire in the broadest sense and how it sort of percolates in the case of Greece. And also, I should say, I mean, I had the privilege and the opportunity to read the whole book for a historical journal review. So it has been very clear to me that is also a very strong case of against the simplistic one-way direction of people sort of generating ideas somewhere in Europe, generally speaking, and then sort of these ideas being imported to Greece, and then sort of they're reworked, and people in Greece do whatever some Europeans, typically Europeans, have invented. Let's say this is not the case in the book, and it was not the case in Greece. And if I may add, a forgotten liberal legacy of the revolution as well. So it's not a forgotten liberal legacy of the 1844, 1864 movements and revolutions and the ideas behind them, but also how Mikhail's book shows how they've kept very powerful the ideas or the achievements of the revolution, which of course was not an absolute monarchy.